we'll start off with kind of like defining what an archetype is, because archetypes were something that Jung discussed a whole lot. In fact, we're going to be talking about Jung's 12 archetypes, or the Jungian 12 archetypes, which are kind of widely recognized archetypes. And archetypes, as you can see here, in very simple terms, this is a very, oh, come on, that's not a very high def picture, but let me see if I can, well, we'll go with this one. I'll just zoom it in. We'll switch to a better one later. Archetypes are symbolic images which we unconsciously understand. And I just want to get that definition, and then we'll move on to a better one. So what does that mean? They're symbolic images that we unconsciously understand. They're things that are recognized throughout the lifespan, similarities and differences based on things that aren't clearly or explicitly explained. They're themes, essentially. They're types, just like how personality types are archetypes in and of themselves because they represent a type of something. Archetypes are kind of the next tier up. They're the wide encompassing net of characteristics. And you'll find that archetypes are, like those little, I think they're German little doll things, the nested eggs or nested figures where it's a doll and then you take it out and it's a little version of it. Then you take it out and it's a little version of it. And you just keep doing that. That's how archetypes work essentially as well, because all archetypes are nested within other archetypes. And that can sound kind of complex, but we can talk a little bit about what that means. So when you look at the Greek gods, there's tons of them, right? There's the let's see, Greek gods. Well, I don't want to be looking at, gods of stuff. Of stuff. Let's see if I can find a good. Well, there's some of them here, but. So, I mean, you've got like Zeus, king of gods, got sky, lightning, thunder, law, Poseidon, got a sea. So, but all of these things, all of these minor characteristics, get further divided the more you look into the Greek gods. And what I mean by that is they started doing this thing where you would start with these grand concepts that represented very primal archetypes of understanding. And then you would have lesser gods, which represented subdivisions of that, which these were also archetypes. But these archetypes were nested within these larger archetypes. And then you would find that there's even gods below that. So let me see if I can find. I hope this is okay to show on Twitch. It's statues, it's art, so I can't imagine it's going to have a huge issue. Well, I don't want to be looking at naked dudes, so everything's got to be naked with the Greeks. So, a great example, the Titans. So, the Greek Titans. Greek Titans. These were the... Oh, get me out of here. These were kind of like the god of gods. So basically zooming in and developing a system that no longer exists. Kind of, yeah. So the Titans represented core elements of existence. Things that were primal, ancient archetypes that are seen no matter what because they're expressed everywhere. Cronus here is one of the Titans. He was the Titan god of time. And what is time? Well, time is one of the most ancient archetypes. It represents something that is eternal and exists across all life, death, these sorts of things. What is an archetype that might be represented within time? Or what is a subdivision of time? Well, you could say something like life or death. Life and death are both things that exist within the context of time. Beginning and end are also archetypes, but they're not the same thing. Beginning and life, while synonymous somewhat, are not exactly the same thing. They're archetypes that stem from similar archetypes. Death and end follow the exact same pattern. They're not the same thing, but they're archetypes that stem from the same archetype. And that archetype can extend back into... it can be difficult to find the root origin of archetypes, because they just, again, like the nested eggs, they just keep going up and up and up until you have these archetypes that are grand, and they're so grand that they encompass, huge aspects of existence. So Cronus is a great example of a kind of primal archetype, time, one of the dominant primeval archetypes. Are they related to Jung's theory? Yeah, we're gonna go into Jung's archetypes here in a second. I'm kind of trying to give a basic explanation of the archetypes in and of themselves, or what archetypes are. So yeah, Cronus represents time, and then you could see like the god of death as being a subdivision of the concept or archetype of time because it represents end, which is an aspect of time. But that's how the Greek gods worked. They essentially took every archetype they could find and turned it into a god. You know, they have gods of beauty, they have gods of fertility, they have gods of spring, they have gods of nature, they have gods of war, there's just a god for everything in Greek philosophy. And that's because they saw all these archetypes and they went, okay, well, these archetypes represent something that we all understand, and therefore there's some sort of divine power with them, and we're going to create these godly figures out of them because they represent the essence of this archetype, the god of hair. Yeah. So, yeah, that's essentially what an archetype is. It's this symbol, not symbol, but it's this symbolic thing that we understand subconsciously that is represented by things. And as Jung points out in his book, it's important to note that the representation of the archetype is not the archetype. It like, again, with the nested egg thing, it goes even deeper. So, like, for example, Cronus as a representation of the archetype of time isn't in and of itself the archetype of time. Time is an entirely different thing in and of itself that is being represented by Cronus, or a god of time. The archetype itself goes deeper. So let's kind of get a little bit less in the abstract and talk more about what this actually means. Why are all these images so blurry today? Okay, so I mean, this one's good, but I don't want to talk about brands. I want to talk about the actual. See, these pictures are nice, but Jung 12. I want to talk about the Jungian 12 archetypes. This is the picture I was just looking at, but it's kind of blurry. But this one's fine enough. Let's go with this one. Or I bet you, no, there's a website I like, actually. 12 Jung archetypes. Okay, here's a great one. So we'll start off with that same image we just saw a minute ago. So these are the primary kind of 12 Jungian archetypes. Now, these are the archetypes that Jung noticed within people. And you might think that's interesting, right? Because Jung also created the personality types. And you might say, okay, well, we have personality types, so how do the archetypes of people separate from personality type? Well, they're two very similar things, so it's kind of hard to differentiate them. But archetypes are more so about motivation, interest, these sorts of things. Or if you think about your personality type in MBTI and Jungian psychology as your operating system, it is the way in which you take in information. You can think of your archetype as closer to something like Enneagram, where it's the software on the computer. How are you using the... yes, I can zoom in, sorry. How are you using the information that you are processing via your operating system? So your personality type takes in information, and your archetype is usually the kind of general motivation for the way in which you are taking in or using that information that you took in. Now, what you'll find is that if you look at these archetypes, there's extremely common archetypes for each of the personality types. And you might be saying, well, there's 12 archetypes, so there's 16 personality types. This might get a little difficult because some are going to overlap, and you're absolutely right. Some of them are going to overlap. You have to remember when Jung originally created the personality types, there was only 8 initial types, though. So back then, it was easier to kind of branch and differentiate them. So let's look at the motivations here of the Jungian 12 archetypes and how these archetypes kind of represent some of the personality types. Just want to say hi to everyone real quick. So Galaxian, thank you for stopping in. Lily, hello, thanks for stopping into the stream. We're talking about archetypes. I hope it doesn't get too crazy for you. It's a complex topic because archetypes go very deep. Right now, we're talking about the Jungian 12 archetypes, which are 12 primary archetypes directed and describing people and their motivations. So again, you can see the archetypes here. Ruler. I'm more of a visual learner, so I like this more, but like this, the descriptions here are really good. So we have artist, for example, the innocent, the sage, the explorer, the outlaw, magician, hero, lover, jester, everyman, caregiver, and ruler. These are going to be the 12 archetypes, and they're divided into groups of 4 groups of 3, which is very similar to how Enneagram has 3 groups of 3, but this just has 4 groups of 3. Bright screen is going to get me blind. I'm sorry. I can't dark mode the web page, I don't think, so I'm very sorry. We'll try to get off this page here. What can I? Aha! Look at this, smart. And then I'll zoom it in just a little bit. There. Is that a little better while we're looking at the thing? So, yeah, there we go. Okay. So look at the quadrants here. There's the 4 groups of 3. Each one of them has their own archetypal primary motivation. So inherently, looking at these archetypes, which are nested on the outside. So the outside archetype is ruler, artist, innocent. They each have an archetype that they represent, such as the artist with innovation, which is then nested within another archetype. So the artist has a desire for innovation, which is nested within the archetype of providing structure in some sort of it. That one might be the hardest to understand, because artist in their relation to script structure is a different. You can use the Dark Reader plugin. I'll check that out sometime. I'm not going to do that on stream, though, because I don't want to like waste time trying to get something to work right now. But the ruler is the great example of this archetypal kind of nest egg thing. The ruler is interested in control, which is nested within the archetype of providing structure. Now, this one is pretty easy. Now, if you were to relate this to a personality type, which one comes to mind first? This is going to be the interesting thing about archetypes, because if you look at the ruler archetype, it generally has 1 or 2 personality types that really stick out as probably being the most likely to be associated with it. And I'm willing to bet at least someone here in the videos. ESTJ, great. That is one of the 2 that I would have said. Yep. The ESTJ, or just as well, the ENTJ. These 2 types are going to, EXTJ. That's right. These are going to be the types that are most associated with the ruler archetype. Now, you'll notice that they're interested in providing structure through control. Providing structure through control. Now, let's look at one to the left, the caregiver. The caregiver is interested in service for the reason of providing structure. Now, this is extremely similar. What type might this represent? Or what 2 types might the caregiver archetype best represent? Or, there's a few types, but in general, what comes to mind when you look at the caregiver who's interested in service, which is a desire to provide structure? Very similar to the ETJ. They want to provide structure. They come from the nested archetype of providing structure. The EFJ. Perfect. Great. Right off the bat. Good job. That's exactly what I am talking about. This is the importance of archetypes and their nested, and the nested nature of them when you look at personality types, because inherently these personality types tend to have inherent motivations within them that go beyond what is on the surface. FEDOMs, people who give service, are interested in structure. They can be people who are very structure oriented. They can even be domineering at times. They can be control freaks, which doesn't seem very natural when you look at just FE as a function in kind of a void. But when you look at the core interest of extroverted feeling, you can generally see that there is an interest to provide structure and control. And this is something that you wouldn't typically see when you just look at the EFJs, but it is there, and I think it's most noticeable when you really see those EFJs who stand up and represent society. So say, for example, look at Martin Luther King. I think Martin Luther King would be Martin Luther King Jr. I think he'd be a great example or great representative of the caregiver archetype, in some sense, because he's interested in providing this kind of community service or providing structure or making people's lives better through the helping of others. he provided structure, he gave a service, he gave his life, and in doing so, he wanted to kind of uplift people and give them a better version of living, which I think Martin Luther King Jr. was an ENFJ, so that makes sense to me. So now we can look at some of the other ones that are a little bit different. They can be kind of interesting. If you look at something like the jester, the jester is an archetype that is interested in pleasure for the sake of connecting to others. Now, the jester might have types that are you're easily able to imagine as coming to mind, but then you could look at a type like the explorer, who is interested in freedom on a spiritual journey, and you can see that there might be some conflict in which types could be represented within these archetypes. So with some types, like the ruler, it's really clear. It's really simple. ETJs, most likely. Maybe ITJs in some circumstances. But with explorers and jesters, there's a lot of crossing of wires. Just as with something like artists and lovers, there's going to be crossing of wires. Or you might find that something like the ruler or the hero could actually be conflicting. So a type who has the archetype of the ruler within them could also have maybe the archetype of the hero and be interested in something akin to mastery. You think extroverted perceivers for explorers can make sense, right? And you're exactly right. The EPs tend to fall into the explorer category, specifically the ESPs, but they can also fall into the jester category. Give me just 1 second. So, what type does the look at the outlaw here? Leave a mark. The leave a mark category. The leave a mark subdivision of archetypes. Outlaw, liberation, leave a mark. Typically within this one, you'll see STPs. And STPs are the type most likely to stand up or revolt against a society that isn't working. If it's not working, we'll fix it by force, essentially. It is a very common mindset for the STP personality types, which is seen in the outlaw. And outlaw doesn't essentially mean bad or, negative. Because if you're someone who breaks the law, you're not inherently a bad person, because the law can sometimes be flawed. For the jester, I would have thought of ETPs, and with the explorers, I would have thought of Ps. Yeah, right. With the jesters, I typically think of the EFP, but again, it's the crossing of wires. It's hard to tell here. But also, you could see, like, ESFPs could easily take up the role of hero, which is interested in mastery, which is interested in leaving a mark. Or you could have the ESFP who is an explorer, who's interested in freedom, who's on a spiritual, or is interested in kind of the spiritual journey. Or you might even have one who's the jester. So this is the interesting thing about personality type and then knowing your general motivation and archetype. And it's very similar to Enneagram. Because if you know your personality type and you know your general motivations in life, you know the hardware and the software of you as a person. How am I taking in information? And then what am I doing with that information? And why am I doing it? Why am I doing these things that I'm doing? The INTJ, I find most often associates with the magician archetype, which the magician archetype is, it says power here. Power isn't the entire purpose of the magician. It's more so to use their gifts. This one isn't the best description, but generally the leave a mark is true. The magician archetype is interested in leaving a mark. They want to leave some sort of mark on life, the world, the universe. And that's usually going to be what's found with the magician. Now, contrast the INTJ, which is typically the magician, with the sage. Now, the sage is interested in knowledge for a spiritual journey. Or for spiritual journey, think of this as a journey of understanding or discovery, which I guess is what spiritual journey kind of makes sense here. So the magician and the sage is how you could contrast something like INTJs and INTPs. INTJs are typically magicians, power, leave a mark, to use their gift to leave a mark. Use their gifts to leave a mark. Whereas with the sage, it's to develop knowledge for their journey or to discover the world around them. These sorts of things. Do you think an INTJ's self-worth comes from their achievement or their individuality? It's a little bit of both. Because as a TEFI middle 2 type, it usually comes from just a little bit of both of those things. They're usually actually pretty inherently tied to one another. So, yeah. INTPs and INTJs can be seen as typically The INTPs as the sage and the INTJ as the magician. Now, the sage could also represent something like an INFJ who has a slight preference for TI, or has a more of an inclination for TI. Not every INFJ is going to be some, super selfless, FE kind of person. Some INFJs might fall into the everyman category, or they enjoy the belonging and connecting with others. The lover, NFJs in particular, are very prone for the lover category. NFJs and even SFPs at times, ISFPs in particular, can fall into that category. But INFJs are kind of interesting because they can go in the sage easily. Theoretically, someone could be any of these things, but you'd be hard pressed to find an ESFP ruler, for example. Like, it's just not. Sure, if you went through history, you could find one, but the odds are it's going to be very difficult. FE can be used in selfish ways, I think. Yeah, it definitely can. And the way I like to describe FE being used in quote unquote selfish ways is if you think of the archetype of like the old mafia matriarch, the mother figure in the mafia movies. If you're one of the sons and you've betrayed the family, then you should be kicked out and you should be stripped of all your honor and worth. That's how FE can be, quote unquote, kind of selfish, as it can dominate the social sphere to a point where you have to kind of live up to the standards that it's setting and live by the rules that it has given for the society. Yeah, you don't get kicked out, you die. That's true. Doflamingo from One Piece. Yeah, it easily could be like that. Yeah. Grandmother of the household. Right, exactly. That's the archetype that you can see with FE in a more dominant position, or a more demanding position. It can easily be a very matriarchal type of energy, whereas TE tends to come off as more typically patriarchal. And if you wanted to see more about how I think about the functions and their relation to masculinity and femininity, I have a video all on that. And I think there is very clear distinctions and functions and how they tend to at least represent themselves archetypically. Yeah, can't talk. So yeah, these are the Jungian 12 archetypes, and they're generally represented within the personality type. So if you're interested, there's some quizzes you can take online, but for the most part, when you look at this circle, you should generally be able to tell kind of at least what quadra you're in terms of what is interesting or important to you. I know that I'm not interested in connecting with others personally. That's not a thing for me. Maybe provide structure, spiritual journey, maybe leave a mark, definitely. Like, this is the one that's definitely closest to what I would ascribe to here, personally. I'm interested in leaving a mark for my own sake. I've always said that I'd like to be in like psychology textbooks one day as someone who's contributed something to the field. And I think that you could see that with many of the INTJs. And I think magician is a good word, because magician goes against the archetype of something like the sage, which the sage is closer to what you would see as the archetype of like the scientist. I think the scientist is a subdivision of the sage. So it would be like sage, scientist, knowledge, journey of understanding. Whereas with magicians, it's a different approach to it. And I was talking about this in my Discord this morning, and how people have forgotten the archetype of what INTJs really tend to be. And the reason that INTJs get viewed kind of weirdly in the current understanding of personality type is because everyone thinks that INTJs are introverted ENTJs. They think of them as socially introverted thinking dominant types, which goes against the initial understanding that Jung had of these types. Remember, they're intuitive dominant types. They're perceiving dominant types. They're not as interested in the thinking for the sake of thinking, and they tend to see it more so as a means to an end, as opposed to their primary motivation. And that's what you see with the magician archetype, is that something like thinking is a means to an end to leave a mark in whatever is interesting to them, which is going to separate them from something more akin to the scientist archetype. And you can see this if you look at someone like Nikola Tesla and compare him to many of the other scientists or people in his field, and you'll see that he was eccentric, and he was more so interested in kind of using his vision to his version of leaving a mark wasn't leaving a mark in terms of being known. It was changing the world. He wanted to change the world through his understanding, which is what I think he certainly did in at least some aspects. You think an ENTJ 819 could be a magician as well? Yeah. And ENTJs could definitely be into the magician category as well. Because remember, ENTJs might not want to be rulers. I've met plenty of ENTJs who could easily fall into the leave a mark category. You're not going to find many ENTJs over here in the connect with others category. That would be quite rare. But easily, these two quadras, structure and leave a mark, could be something that is interesting. I think the ESFP is probably one of the most interesting types to me because I think the ESFP is kind of the wild card. And you could see the ESFP in a lot of different archetypes. You could see him in Explorer, you could see him in Outlaw, you could see him in Hero, you could see him in Jester, you could see him in Magician, you could see him in Lover. Everyman, like the ESFP is very diverse. A lot of ENTJs that are underdogs. Yeah, the ENTJ. Yeah. So I think a good example of that could be. Well, no, I think that's an INTJ. Never mind. I was gonna say Virgil from Devil May Cry, but he's an INTJ, and one of my favorite fictional characters. But he literally says power and might are everything, and it's because he has this twisted version of what needing power does. The power obsessed people. When you look at someone who's interested in power, why are they interested in power? Is it power for the sake of control, or is it power for the sake of leaving a mark? Are they wanting to structure and organize and control everything, or do they want to do something with the power? That is a very clear distinction, not clear, but it's a very subtle distinction that you have to be aware of when you're looking at something like archetypes and motivations. A lot of ENTJs, a lot of NTJs in general can be control or structure oriented, or they can be leave a mark. Now, you might even find that yeah, Virgil, best character. Yes, he is. He is the storm that is approaching. So the artist archetype is interesting because it's kind of about innovation, right? And the artist could easily be something like an ISFP, how we traditionally think of as being artists, but it could also be something like the ENTP, who's interested in innovation. Now, you might be asking, how does innovation lead to providing structure, right? Because how is innovation related to providing structure? Innovation leads to the updating of structure. It leads to the continuation of structure. Usually when someone is innovating, it's because they're trying to change the meta. Right, yeah. You're trying to come up with a new way of having structure. A lot of the times, this is archetypically different from something like the outlaw, who's interested in liberation or leaving the mark, who desires to tear down a system that isn't working. Whereas the innovator, the scientist, the Da Vinci type of person is interested in updating or making better a system that provides structure. There's inherently an interest in the structure itself, even if they're currently not invested in it or they want it to change. Just because you don't like structure doesn't mean you aren't motivated in providing or living within structure. It just means you're not satisfied with where the structure is at this very moment. Many ENTPs, for example, are very comfortable and interested in things like structure. They're just going to be trying to update it. They're going to be trying to make it something better than it is now. So that covers the kind of core 12 archetypes. I encourage you, if you're interested, maybe try and find your archetype and see what that means. So let me see, what else do I want to talk about? Oh, so the archetype of the sage is an interesting one, because there's lots of different interpretations of the archetype of the sage. And what do I mean by this? Because the sage is represented in the Jungian 12 as desiring knowledge for the sake of understanding. That's how it's described more originally in Jung's interpretation. It goes to spiritual journey here, but it was knowledge for the sake of understanding as opposed to knowledge for the sake of use or power. Now, when you look at the sage and what we traditionally associate with something like a sage, like what do you think of when you think of a sage? You can think of maybe like an old hermit type person sits in the wood. You could think of a kind of gypsy-like lady who has foresight or perception. The sage is also something that represents introverted intuition in terms of perception or insight. Let me see if I can find like a good picture of what I'm trying to represent here. Sage. I did not looking for the plant sage. Sage person. Like this type of person, right? Like the Gandalfs of the world are representative of the sage. These very like INFJ-esque figures. And Gandalf is a good representation of that kind of understanding of sage knowledge. I think that's something that Gandalf was. But I think the sage is also representative of perception and insight if you look at it from a different, old guy with a long beard. That's exactly right. So there's a quote I like from the game Hades. Have any of you played the game Hades? It was an indie game that came out last year. It's really good. It's a good game. If you like archetypes, I strongly recommend it. There's a quote that stuck out to me. I talked about it in a video I did a few months ago. It was probably at least a year ago at this point. That I think was really powerful. And you meet Hermes, and Hermes is kind of the Greek trickster god, right? Hermes, Hades. I want to see if I can find it. Yeah. This one. This little guy. You meet Hermes in the game Hades. And he's the messenger god. He's the god of trickster, kind of mischief as well. And he says a quote that really stands out to me. Gosh, what was? I want to get the wording exactly right here. Give me a second. I have a picture of it because it stood out to me. I'm gonna go pull it up. So give me like 20 seconds. Where is it? Here it is. He says, "Know that saying, don't be hasty? That comes from me, I swear. A little way to stave off the competition. Masquerading as the wisdom of a sage. Those stupid mortals will buy anything." Masquerading as the wisdom of a sage. This was something that really stood out to me when I played this game, because archetypically, Hermes is representative of extroverted intuition. He's representative of change, growth, trickster, all of these type of archetypes that are very common, especially when you look at gods in fiction and history. And he says masquerading as the wisdom of the sage, as the wisdom of he who knows, who has seen. And these two things are kind of oppositional to each other. And I think the sage aspect that he was referring to there was kind of the introverted intuition, wisdom, or perception aspect that is found when you look at types, especially like the INFJ, who encompasses the sage archetype even more. I think the INFJ is kind of like the prime example of the sage as opposed to the INTJ, even though the INTJ still has some of that aspect about them. And to me, that was just powerful because I think those archetypes are extremely related but very similar. And you can find them pretending to be each other at certain points, or you can find them, at odds with each other. And a good example of this is if you look at Loki. And I don't want to spoil the new Loki show if anyone's interested in watching. It's really good. But I am going to talk just a smidge about it. And I'm going to talk about the archetype of Loki as a god. Loki is very similar to Hermes in that he is a trickster god. He is an agent of change, an agent of chaos. What could be as opposed to what is. And extroverted intuition as an archetype is oppositional to introverted intuition, even though they're both intuition. Because introverted intuition is more akin to something like destiny or singular outcome, whereas extroverted intuition is representative of branching changes or futures that are not contained or controlled. This is why introverted intuitives tend to be hyper-focused on a single outcome or a single desired future or a single desired thing that they want to do in life, whereas extroverted intuitives tend to be very willing to kind of dance around the things that are interesting or go between a few things that are interesting to them. They don't want to be bound by one singular purpose, idea, these sorts of things. So you can find that in the archetypes of NE, or the characters that are representative of the archetype of NE or change, that this is a theme that is present in their stories, their mythos. If you look at Hermes, if you look at Loki, there's this very common theme of, escaping what should be, getting out of trouble, avoiding destiny. And that is something that's very present in the new Loki show. If you go watch it, it's kind of one of the common themes. It's escaping destiny or escaping something that should or should not happen to you. And I think that that's why extroverted intuition and introverted intuition tends to be oppositional towards each other. Now, I think you can also see, like Hermes said that he masqueraded as the wisdom of the sage, as in he was pretending to be a sage, he was pretending to be wise, to give humans insight and wisdom to help them live their lives. I think you can also see this in reverse, where you can see introverted intuitive characters tending to pretend to be the trickster archetype or the jester archetype. And this is going to be an obscure reference that probably not many of you are going to get unless you play a lot of video games. But there's a character from the Five Nights at Freddy's series that immediately comes to mind named Glitchtrap. And Glitchtrap is a terrible, terrible villain who does bad things and kills people, and he's awful. And he wears this furry bunny suit, and it's got this weird, wacky smile, and he pretends to be wacky, and he's a terrible person. But he is far closer to what I would consider an introverted intuitive type villain, in that everything he does is extremely calculated, planned. It's not sporadic. There is a destiny. You can't escape his interest and insight. I'm going to go away because I don't want to look at Five Nights at Freddy's stuff too much. But I think that character is a strong representation of the sage masquerading as the jester, as a reverse role, where someone who has this insight is pretending to be someone who is sporadic or outgoing in an effort to kind of find their single destiny, or to converge the chaos into one outcome that they're interested in. Because essentially that's what Hermes is doing. When Hermes lies about the wisdom of the sage, when he tells these people that he has wisdom and he's just tricking them, he's trying to take that singular outcome and turn it into something sporadic. He's trying to branch the timelines, essentially. Whereas if you look at the character Glitchtrap, he's doing the opposite, where he's pretending to be this sporadic, chaotic creature so he can get to a single desired outcome that will be interesting to him, or be the thing that he wants. I know that was kind of a tangent there, but I think it is an interesting distinction, and I haven't talked much about that before, so I wanted to at least bring it up. So at this point, does anyone have any questions? I want to stop for a minute just to make sure that if there's anybody here who's interested in asking some questions, it doesn't have to be about the archetypes themselves. If you have other questions, that's fine too. Let me read this. Gandalf, you think, was an INTJ? I could see the case for Gandalf being an INTJ, actually. And again, it goes back to the idea that I spoke about earlier, where people forget that INTJs are introverted intuitive dominants as well. And it's very easy, I think, for them to get mistyped. A lot of people think that you have to have a ton of TE to be an INTJ, when in reality, many INTJs are very laid back and perceptive because they're perceiving dominant types. Are we still live and good? I just want to make sure everyone's still with me right now. I don't see anyone chatting in the chat. If not, I'll just keep going, but just want to make sure that the stream is still alive. So we covered the archetypes. Let me see. Yes, we listen. Good teacher you are. Okay. Well, thank you. Oh, there's another layer to the Jungian 12 archetypes that I forgot to go over. And that's the whole the ego, self, soul thing. I'm not going to go too much into that right now, but you can look more into that if you want to. Okay, so here's the kind of prime descriptions of the Jungian 12 archetypes. We can talk a little bit about these. So a lot of these ones you wouldn't find many people would want to be aligned with, especially if if you're someone who's interested in MBTI. It's kind of like the intuition bias thing. Like, nobody wants to be the innocent, for example, but a lot of people in reality are going to be the innocent. Every core archetype in the Jungian 12 has a kind of a motto, a core desire, a goal, and a fear, and then there's strategies in which they go about doing things. Think of these things very much like Enneagram types. So the innocent, for example, the motto is free to be you, free for you to be you and me to be me. I'm going to rephrase that because I don't think I said it very well. Core desire to get to paradise, or to be happy, essentially. To get to paradise, to be happy. When I think of the innocent, I think of something like an INFP or ISFP. Free for me to be me and you to be you, and I just want to be happy. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard you know, this very phrase come from introverted feeling dominance. Oh, I just want to be happy, or I just want to be, doing well. I just want to live a good life. These sorts of things, and I want to be me, and I don't want to have to not be any, or I don't want to be anyone else. I think a lot of IFP types can fall into this category, but not all IFPs. The everyman. I think the everyman is. Well, let me read the description first. The all men and women are created equal. Core desire to connect with others, to belong. Greatest fear is to be left out or to stand out from the crowd. Strategy develop. Solid virtues be down to earth. The common touch. This is something probably close to an ST. Many of the ST types, SJs maybe. Like ISTJs probably come to mind. Maybe something like even certain STP types in certain cases. I know that ISTPs and even INTPs can have a great fear of standing out from the crowd if repressed extroverted feeling is something that is a real pressure point to them, or even some of the higher FE types. Everyman sounds like FE2 in a way, right? Exactly. That's what I'm saying here is that the types who have the FE struggles might struggle with that. It could be higher FE types as well, though. Maybe the SFJs. The hero is an interesting one. I think this is one that tends to stand out, and it's one that's extremely common in fiction. Like the hero archetype is so common, you see it, and literally it's like the protagonist, right? Where there's a will, there's a way. Core desire to prove one's worth through courageous acts. Goal, expert mastery in a way that improves the world. Greatest fear, weakness, vulnerability, being a chicken. Be as strong and competent as possible. I have always said, I've said it for years now, I think the hero is the mirror. It's the mirror of the INTJ archetype. And that I think it's the ESFP. I think the ESFP is like the absolute epitome of what the hero archetype represents. Will, acts, sounds like SE, right. I think the hero archetype is essentially the ESFP, or especially if you look at fiction. There's a reason 99% of like shonen protagonists in manga are ESFPs, and it's because they follow this where there's a will, there's a way type of thing, where if you knock them down, they just get right back up and they keep trying. SE and FI, right, exactly. I think this is something that's extremely common in fiction. The hero archetype is represented very well by the ESFP, and it's why on the other end of things, you have the opposite end of that spectrum where you have the twisted hero or the villain who very much follows the same archetype, but from a twisted point of view. If you think about it, the villain and the hero archetype are essentially, the same thing. They're extremely similar. I'm going to do my thing. If there's a will, there's a way. I'm going to prove myself. I'm going to become a master at the thing that is interesting to me. They don't want to be weak or vulnerable, become competent. There usually is some sort of aspect of control to it as well, which is why you might see them in the control aspect or the control territory. The Dragon Slayer. Yeah. But yeah, essentially the hero is the individual who goes out to slay the metaphorical dragon. So then we have the caregiver. Caregiver is probably an easy one. Sort of reflection of your personal experience. Every ESFP you come across around grown age or younger relationship automatically defaults to one of temporary mentorship. Interesting. That is interesting. I like ESFPs. ESFPs are actually one of my favorite types. I like the EFPs in general. ENFPs and ESFPs are probably my two favorite for extended interaction, just because they're interesting. So the caregiver, this one's easy, right? FE. It just screams FE. Like when we associate FE, this is what's going to be here. Especially probably the SFJs. Love your neighbor as yourself. Protect and care for others. Help others. Selfishness and ingratitude is their fear. Strategy, doing things for other. Weakness is martyrdom and being exploited. Right. This is a big thing when you look at FE DOMs or even FE auxiliaries. When we talk about FE types or do coaching with FE types, we have to remember that if you give too much of yourself, you're just going to get walked all over. You're going to really struggle. Oh, that brings us down to the soul type. So let me go back up and you can see that we just went through the ego types or the I types. So the ego is to leave a mark on the world. Or it describes, oh, these are the four. So kind of the ego or the I type. So the me, what am I interested in? The soul types tend to be interested in things a little bit disconnected from the self in the exact same way. Caregiver sounds like Enneagram 2 and FE. Well, yeah, right. Isn't Enneagram 2 the caregiver? I think Enneagram may have been loosely based off of these archetypes in some sense, but I'm not entirely sure. Soul types, the explorer. Motto, don't fence me in. The freedom to find out who you are through exploring the world. Goal, to experience a better, more authentic, more fulfilling life. Biggest fear, getting trapped, conformity, and inner emptiness. So here's an interesting. We just talked about the hero, but now we go down and we look at the explorer, and you might think to yourself, this also sounds a little bit like an ESFP, right? Right? Yeah, like, don't fence me in. I want to explore. I want to go out and seek the world. I think it's because you can have different archetypes for the same type. So an ESFP can be a hero, and I think that very much represents who they are, but I also think that an ESFP could be an explorer, or an ISFP, right, Captain? Good thinking. These types can easily encompass one or other of the things, and it goes back to the idea of what is the core desire of the person. If you are an ESFP and you're a hero, you're interested in mastery and leaving a mark. Or if you're an ESFP and you're an explorer, you're interested more so in freedom and the journey. And that's going to be the difference in the archetypes of each personality type, or each person's archetype. It's kind of your primary motivation of the thing that guides and interests you. So the rebel is an interesting one, because the rebel stands out to me as very much being one or two very likely types. Motto, rules are made to be broken. Core desire, revenge or revolution. Goal, to overturn what isn't working. Fear, to be powerless or ineffectual. Strategy, disrupt, destroy, shock. Weakness, crossing over to the dark side, crime. So I think the rebel very much encompasses the ISTP and the ESTP. I think just the STPs in general. I think the STPs are the types who are most, the ETPs. Yeah, maybe ENTP as well. I think it's the STPs, just a little bit more in general, who follow this. And it's because of this goal to overturn wasn't working in a very physical, direct way. The STPs are very willing to stand up and make a change when something isn't working, or try to force change. They want to break, if the system doesn't work, break it. That's essentially what the STP can do. And they're not afraid to get their hands a little dirty to do that. And that could be something as simple as an engineer who has a thing that he needs to, build or construct, and he'll literally tear it apart so he can figure out how it works, so then he can put it back together and understand it. That could be something within the rebel archetype, because they're going to break their rules and do what they have to do to get that understanding or make things working in the way that they're going to need to work. The lover. This one's interesting. The lover. Motto, you're the only one. Core desire, intimacy and experience. Goal, being in a relationship with people. Work and surroundings they love. Greatest fear, being alone. A wallflower, unwanted, unloved. Strategy, to become more and more physically and emotionally attractive. Weakness, outward directed desire to please others at risk of losing your own identity. So this one is, again, one of them that relates very well to one that we saw a few moments ago. The lover is very related to the caregiver. They're very similar. But it's one of those things where you could have two types, or two people of the exact same type, and each one of them might encompass a different archetype. So the lover here is very likely to be an EFJ, or just an FJ, I would say. Probably any of the FJ types. I see the lover more with NFJs than SFJs. And I think, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, the NFJ, I think there's very much more of that desire here with the NFJ types. So I think that, again, if you go back to this, you could have an INFJ or specifically ENFJ more likely, who is either a lover who's interested in intimacy and connecting with others, or you could have an ENFJ who is more so interested in structure through service and caregiving. Those are going to be those core differences in archetypes. The creator or artist. If you can imagine it, it can be done. Core desire to create things of enduring value. Goal, to realize a vision. Greatest fear, or mediocre vision or execution. Strategy, develop artistic control and skill. So this one is another one, again. Multiple types could fit into this. Creator and artist. What comes to mind initially is either NPs or SPs. Any of those types, any of the NPs or the SPs. They, see, they have a talent for creativity and imagination, but they have a weakness towards perfectionism or maybe even bad solutions, coming up with things on the spot. The creator is also known as the artist, the inventor, innovator, musician, writer, dreamer. NPs and SPs is what comes to mind. But remember, again, you could be an NP or an SP who's interested in innovation and providing or updating structure, as we talked about earlier. If that sounds confusing, go watch a little bit earlier where I talked about that. Or you could be an NP or an SP who's an explorer, or you could be one who is a jester. And that's, again, it goes back to those core motivations. So the self types, and you might be thinking, self, well, self is kind of related to ego, right? Like they're very, very similar. And yes, there is a difference. And let me see if they have a description on the page here that would better explain it than how I would. I don't think they have. No, they use this image, but this one's kind of confusing because they have the quadras, but they don't have the thing. Anyway, I'll try to. I don't want to waste time on it. We'll come back to that. So the self types are kind of, again, focused on the self. What can they do? How can I change things? As opposed to maybe the ego types, who are more so, who am I, or where do I fit in within the world that I'm within? So the jester, motto, YOLO, you only live once. Core desire, to live in the moment with full enjoyment. Which type might be very likely to live in the moment with full enjoyment? Goal, to have a great time and lighten up the world. Fear, being bored or boring others. This is an important aspect for the jester. Strategy, play, make jokes, be funny. Hello, Pimpin' Squid. It wasn't Moby. How's it going? We're talking about archetypes, Moby. So the jester archetype here, what does it encompass essentially? Like, play, make jokes, be funny. Just earlier, ENTP. Great, perfect. I was just talking earlier about Loki. And Loki, I think, is a great example of the jester archetype, which is a child of the archetype of change, which is a kind of child of the archetype of just entropy in general, or they're interrelated with each other. So, again, look at it again. You could be an ENFTP who's a jester, who's interested in the pleasure aspect and connecting with others, or you could be an ENTP who's an artist who's interested in innovation and providing structure. Your core archetype is going to influence your primary motivations in life. And I'm going to do that with all of the archetypes, just to give an example of all the types that we're talking about. So the sage, this is the interesting one that I went back to earlier. The sage is in the same aspect of the self types. The sage is also a self type, and they're extremely related. The jester and the sage are oppositional but related, because I think at their essence they most represent extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. ENTP innovator equals more TI, jester equals more FE. Yeah, and you could easily see it as being kind of like the subtype sort of thing, where maybe a ENTP who with healthier FE is more likely to be something akin to the jester. If you look at characters like Loki, and even from the Loki show or even in history, these were ENTPs who didn't have a ton of TI. They were very much still TI FE in their function stack, but they weren't huge TI, correct everything. It's because they had a very strong understanding of their FE and it came very naturally to them. I'm not a huge fan of subtypes, but I do think that there are individuals who have more of a kind of presence with their third function in some sense, but I wouldn't describe it as a different type. I have a whole video on that. So the sage is... The sage could be TI in a way too. It is. You're absolutely right. I think the sage is actually better represented by TI than NI. But I think that it's one of those things where both the sage and the magician represent NI. And I'll explain what I mean by that here in a moment. Which is why I think the sage is most actually encompassed by INFJs who have both. I think the INFJ is more akin to the sage. So, motto, the truth will set you free. Core desire, to find the truth. Oh, wow, sounds pretty TI, right? Goal, to use intelligence and analysis to understand the world. Biggest fear, being duped, misled, or ignorance. Strategy, seeking out information or knowledge. Self-reflection and understanding thought processes. Can study weaknesses, can study details forever and never act. This is a weakness that both INTPs and INFJs can really struggle with. And despite the fact that INFJs are IJs and they typically like to act, I've seen tons of INFJs who get into that kind of analysis paralysis decision making process where they just look over their thing, or they contemplate, or they get existential, these sorts of things. This is the weakness of the sage, is that they can get stuck in the analysis paralysis stage. And that's why it's important for those who fall within this archetype to represent, or to say, okay, now that I have my wisdom, now that I have my insight, what am I going to do with it? But that could just be me coming from me as someone who identifies with the magician archetype. I strongly resonate with this, and you'll see how they contrast. I think the magician is strongly representative of the INTJ personality type, but also maybe even ISTJs at times, and that might be surprising, but I think ISTJs are actually very similar in some cases. I don't think people give ISTJs enough credit, but we'll talk about that. Motto: I make things happen. Core desire: understanding the fundamental laws of the universe. Why? Now this might sound very similar to this though. The sage: to use intelligence analysis to understand the world. The magician: understanding the laws of the universe. It's like, oh, they're almost the same thing. Then you go down to the next step though. And for the magician, they use the fundamental laws of the universe to make the dreams come true. I wish to understand the universe. I wish to understand how things work so I can do something with that. The magician is more TE focused. Yeah, it could be more TE focused, or it could just be more extroverted, judging focused in general. Because I think that INFJs could also theoretically fall into the magician category. I just don't think it's one of those rare archetypes where it could happen, but it's not as likely. I think the ITJs, because extroverted thinking is more so goal oriented, is far more likely to naturally fall into the magician archetype. Which is why it's very easy for me to look at the sage and go, oh, well, you need to make sure that you're actually using this information that you are taking in and learning about. INTPs and INFJs, come on, use the TI. And meanwhile, they're looking at me like, you dummy, you haven't even begun to understand or look at these things deeply because you're not spending enough time researching them or looking into them. That's how the sage sees the magician, and that's how the magician sees the sage, is they have this kind of twisted view of each other, where the magician says, okay, sage, get your stuff together, and the sage says, okay, magician, slow down and figure your stuff out. The strategy for the magician is to develop a vision and live by it. And this is one of those things where I think ISTJs can also fall into this category too, because ISTJs are actually types with very strong visions. They're introverted perception dominance as well. Their vision is just not usually like future focused. They very much want to develop their vision. What is life supposed to be like for them? What do they perceive within? How are they going to bring this into reality? And then they do something with it. Yeah, I think INFJs could fall into magician, but kind of like understanding the fundamental laws of relationships, since FE is their extrovert judging process. Right, that's actually a good way of thinking about it. Nikola Tesla, probably magician archetype. Yes, Captain V. And if you saw earlier in the video, I said something very similar. Nikola Tesla was very much a magician archetype. And look at Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton. There's a quote. What's the quote? I'm pretty sure it's Isaac Newton, right? Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians. This is a quote that stands out to me when we look at Newton, because everyone types Newton as an INTJ, right? Like most people type Isaac Newton as an INTJ. His way of understanding and coming to the conclusions that he came to were not in the same. Well, I made a new window. Were not the same as you would see with a TI motivated person, or someone who's interested in understanding for the sake of understanding. He was very much an eccentric. He was very much someone who, was mystical in nature. He was actually very religious, and that was one of the reasons they talk about this. Because Isaac Newton was very much a religious person. But the magician is very much someone who is more associated with things that are a little bit more mystical in nature, and they're not exactly always going to be the most realistic and down to earth. They can very much have their head in the clouds. The magician is inherently a dreamer. So INTJs can be, I think their most common archetype is the magician, which is interested in power to leave a mark. They're interested in kind of developing their skill sets so that they can leave a mark, which is very close to the hero who's interested in mastery. They both have very similar archetypes. But I also think that I think INTJs, just like INFJs could be magicians, I think INTJs could be sages. I think you could have an INTJ sage. It wouldn't be impossible. It's going to be one of those things that's a little bit more rare. And you could also maybe have an INTJ who's a ruler, who's interested in control. I don't think you're going to find an INTJ in this quadra very easily. I mean, there's probably someone out there, but I think magician, sage, ruler would be the three most common in that order. Magician being the most common, then sage, then ruler. Piaget was trying to reintegrate science and religion. Okay, yeah, it's a good point. So the last archetype we have is the ruler, and this is the one that's pretty self-explanatory, right? You want to rule. Power isn't everything; it's the only thing. Core desire, control, create a prosperous, successful family or community. Moby, if you're watching, I definitely think you probably fall into this archetype. Strategy to exercise power, greatest fear, chaos being overthrown, weakness being authoritarian, I'm unable to delegate at times, talent, responsibility, and leadership. They tend to fall into the boss, the leader, aristocrat, king, queen, this sort of thing. The ruler is another example of a primal archetype, and one thing is if core desire being control of what and for what. So we'll go back to the thing here. Control, the ruler desires control to provide structure. And structure inherently means interaction with some sort of community or system. So the ruler desires to have control to control a system or structure. That could be anything from a family to a community to a country to anything. It could just be whatever their system of interaction is within. It's just like how, an FJ who's the caregiver could be interested in service or providing structure through service, but only for the sake of whatever they're interested in. An FJ could be only interested in their family, and everything outside of their family gets none of this. Or they could be interested in their community, and anything outside of their community gets none of this. Or their nation, and anything outside of their nation gets none of this. It's very selective, these motivations, and what they work towards. Now, you could be a very open person. You could be a caregiver who has almost no selective, process for what you're choosing to give service over. Just like how you can have a ruler who wants to control everything. Thanos comes to mind as a ruler archetype who wants to control and provide structure. Thanos is like the ruler. I'm literally going to do something that's going to affect the entire universe for the sake of control and providing structure, because the universe needs resources. So I will take control and I will provide structure by taking over the universe, essentially. And what's interesting is, if you'll notice about Thanos, after he did that, after he provided the structure, he stepped down and he went and lived in a little forest somewhere. And it's because for him, the control and the providing structure was the inherent motivation and the goal. So once that was done, his motivation was completed. He didn't want to control just for the sake of control. It was control for the sake of providing structure. And that's where you can kind of be on different lines of each of these archetypes. So right, those are the 12 archetypes. Those are the 12 Jungian archetypes. Power for the sake of power is weak. That's what the magician. Well, yeah, magician wants power for the sake of leaving a mark. And I think the thing about this circle here is you can definitely, if you're unhealthy, get stuck in the circle. So what does that mean? You can be a ruler who gets stuck in control and never gets down to your core archetype of structure. Or you could be an artist who's interested in innovation, but you never get to the point of providing structure. And what might that look like? The ENTP who creates things to disrupt society just for the sake of disruption and innovation without actually wanting to provide any structure for anyone. Or you could be the innocent who's obsessed with safety, but not for the sake of journey and discovering the self, just for the sake of making sure you're not going to be harmed. A reclusive kind of safety instead of a more optimistic one. So each one of these archetypes can get stuck in the ring, essentially. So those are the primary things that I wanted to talk about. So let's anyone have any questions or things that they want to ask or want me to talk about? We've been going about an hour, so I usually like to go for about an hour and a half, so I've still got about 20 minutes of what I'm willing to stretch this out into. So if you've got questions, now is a great time to answer them. Let me go back and see if I can. Corporate perspective of the Jungian archetypes. All right, who's the magician? Sky and Lynx. I don't even know who these companies are. University of Cambridge. All right, that's kind of boring. Can ENTPs give off high SE, or are they likely mistyped? Well, it depends on what you mean by high SE. If you mean SE actions, as in doing things, that's not, it wouldn't actually be SE. Because remember, your cognitive functions are your operating system, your way of taking in information. They're not what you do with that information. Again, the motivations and the archetypes are more so what you do with those motivations. So, for example, in my video on cognitive functions and why they aren't actions, I say that if I punch someone in the face, that's not extroverted sensing. And unfortunately, that's what half the community thinks. Half the community thinks that if you're going for a jog, you're doing extroverted sensing. Or if you engage in some sort of activity, you're doing extroverted sensing. When in reality, it's more so that extroverted sensing is far more likely to find itself in those types of positions. It's far more likely to be doing those things because it's inherently interactive with the outer world. Would I be interested in live typing streamers on Twitch? Maybe, I guess. I don't know. Like, depends on who it was. I do the analysis videos sometimes, but usually not live. Comes down to interpretation of information, not necessarily action. Exactly, Kyle. That's right. So it's whatever information you take in, and then what you do with it is based on you. So Pippin Squid Moby asks, to what extent are these archetypes interdependent? Well, that's the interesting thing, because all archetypes derive from some sort of archetype. So the further you go out, the more you find that it's more of a nested egg type of situation. And as I spoke about in the beginning of the stream, you might have missed this. I talked about how the Greek gods are a perfect example of nested archetypes, because all of the Greek gods derive from some sort of greater god, which is a concept that better represents the archetype that they are. So Thanatos, for example, is representative of death. And what is death? Death is an archetype of the end. And what is the end? Well, end is an archetype nested within something akin to time, where the end is represented by time, because time has to have some sort of beginning or end, or a time end is part of time. All of these archetypes are nested within something that is a higher purpose. And I think that the interdependency of them all depends on what archetype are they coming from. And some of the Jungian 12 might be coming from common similar archetypes, but I think Jung's interpretation was that these archetypes were distinct enough that they wouldn't be interdependent because they're so distinct, or at least not until you got very high up in the chain of archetypal representation. King, Warrior, Lover, Magician, and Bookmar talks about, for example, the King archetype shadow is the tyrant to the weakling, and for the Magician as the detached manipulator. Right. So yeah, there's been a lot of further research on these archetypes and how they can become represented by things like the tyrant. You're absolutely right here. Because these things, once Jung started talking about them, people took these ideas and they were like, oh man, these are actually really good. You know, we talk about the infant tyrant, I believe, is like something akin to that, where it's like the boss who's just an angry baby. Moby, you might, I think we and I had a conversation about this a long time ago, but I don't remember. Because there's a website that talks about the archetypes of men and how they can likely present themselves, which I think is a bit of a basic understanding of it, but it covers some of the same topics. Given a social structure, whether family or community, seems fairly obvious. The ruler requires the jester, sage, and hero. Oh, so that's what you mean by interdependency. Okay. Yeah. So, for example, a ruler with nothing to rule is not much of a ruler, right? So some of the archetypes are more reliant on the other people. I think the archetypes that fall within the realm of self, the self archetypes, are the least reliant on others, with exception maybe being the ruler, because again, the ruler without anything else is not going to have much to rule. But for example, the sage and the magician usually aren't terribly interested in like sharing wisdom or knowledge unless it's someone comes to them for it. Like the sage doesn't go out into the world to spread his knowledge. Usually, it's more so that people come to him to seek the knowledge. The magician usually isn't trying to prove his worth to the outside world. It's to prove and design and make his dream come true for his own sake, to accomplish the self goal. The jester usually tricks other people for self fun, interest, fun, this sort of thing. Whereas if you look at types who are ego types, for example, they're inherently interconnected with others, because ego essentially means, in this case, my self-image in relation to others who are observing me, or in relation to how others perceive or interact with me. So the hero isn't much of a hero if he's not impressing anyone. You know, the hero isn't a hero unless he's saving someone, unless he's done something that's going to impress or show off, or, you know, these sorts of things. And the caregiver isn't much of a caregiver if they're not giving care, if there's no one to give care to. But for something like the ruler's an interesting one, because rulers can provide and give structure even on their own independent projects. So the ruler can create a system or develop things and have control over that structure theoretically independently. And you could think of this as something like a building simulation game, where somebody wants to build a city all on their own and they want to structure exactly how it looks. They might be able to find that kind of pseudo-satisfaction there. The ego is more concerned about how the outside world perceives them, whereas the self doesn't really care about that. It's not inherently that the ego type is concerned with what the outer world thinks, and it's in like a negative connotation. It's more so that it's more of a two-way street, where it's like they are giving out, they're doing something for the outer world in hopes that will be returned in some sense. Where, you know, the caregiver can't give care just to themselves, so they have to give care, and in return they want to receive love and appreciation for that care. Whereas the hero wants to save or be competent, whereas in return they want appreciation for that competence. So you could ask yourself, you know, is this selfish? Because in theory, you know, oh, it's like, they're just doing it for appreciation. But then you go look at the self types, and they're even more selfish, because the self types are completely focused on, well, I'm going to do it for me, and I don't care, you know, whatever, if someone else happens to drop in, cool, whatever. But if it's for me, I'm doing it for me, and these the main reason. So both of them kind of have a selfish tint to them, and I think that they can be twisted into being selfish or selfless. So it really just depends on how you know, kind of arrive at, or how healthy you are, essentially. And then the weird ones are the soul types, because the soul types are more so interested in pursuing, I almost want to say like a higher purpose type of thing. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but like, you know, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, and the artist, they're seeking some sort of purpose. The artist wants to create, to bring things into the world. And it's not for the sake of themselves or others. It's through this natural pursuit or interest. The lover is interested in kind of having this romantic kind of relationship type of thing, which might seem like this one up here, or it might even seem selfish sometimes, but I think it's somewhere in the middle, which is why it's in the soul type as opposed to the others. Whereas the rebel wants to tear down the systems that don't work and change the world, and the explorer wants to kind of go on their journey. These are all more journey focused. They're more about experience or doing things that are meaningful to them as an individual, but also might have others in that calculation. And how that twisting happens in the yeah. Okay. All right. So 1 hour 20 minutes. I'll go for a few more minutes. Anyone have any last kind of questions, things that they want to ask, talk about archetypes? I still, if you haven't played Hades, go play Hades. It's a great game, and it's very archetypal. Greek gods in general are just extremely archetypal. You can find out more information about these archetypes online. They're really easy to come across. Although it's kind of like MBTI, because sometimes you get very watered down versions of it, like outlaw, break rules. I mean, yeah, outlaws want to break rules, but why do they want to break rules? What purpose do they want to break the rules? And it's because the outlaw wants to leave a mark, or they want to change the system. 48 laws of power. Do you think they're incredibly useful? Just repeating the question. Assume you missed it. Yeah, sorry, I must have missed it. I have heard of them. I've never read about it, though. How does the sage deal with the questions of the validity of human knowledge? I mean, that's kind of a big philosophical question. I think that would just depend on the individual. That's like asking, how would an INTP handle a question? It kind of really just depends on how that INTP understands things or what system they currently follow. The sage inherently wants to discover the universe and how it works to have understanding for the sake of understanding, because it's inherently interesting to them. It's inherently, like a spiritual journey type of thing. Yeah. Oh, I got my things mixed up. Yeah, the sage is a spiritual journey type. I don't know why I got mixed up here. Because the soul types are not the spiritual journey. I got mixed up, so sorry about that. Some of these types, I always get these ones and then these ones mixed up, because that's the confusing one. So you can kind of be outside of your. Each of the quadrants has an ego, self, and soul type within it. So, for example, in the mastery quadra, or the leave a mark quadra, you have the hero who is ego focused, or they're interactive with self and others for the sake of that. You have the magician who's self focused and not interested in the two-way street of communication. And then you have the outlaw who's soul, who's doing it for some sort of divine purpose. And then you kind of look over here and you can see how they each fall into one of these categories. Just innovation is soul driven, lover is soul driven, explorer is soul driven. And you'll notice how I said that INTJs can be most likely magicians, sages, or rulers. All three of these are self. And that's something important to think. A lot of the times, whatever type or archetype you're sticking within is usually going to be within one of these that's similar in nature, even though it might not be. Do you types ever use it, or is it possible to learn to use the functions not in the main stack of 4? My personal opinion is no, but that's because I follow a strictly 4-function model. And the reason I follow this is because Jung described there being 4 functions, not 8. But the 4 functions have 2 attitudes, which I think is something that is a common misconception in type, and that we assume that there's 8 functions when it's 4 with 2 attitudes. Think of each one being a coin with 2 sides. They're not 2 inherently different things. They're one thing with 2 different sides. Ruler, hero, and explorer hit you good? Yeah. So ruler is self. Hero is ego. Okay, so you've got a little bit of the self-ego soul in there. So yeah, I think this is kind of interesting. It's an interesting topic. Jung's archetypes are interesting. Archetypes in general are interesting. I've been thinking a lot about archetypes recently because I've been watching the show Loki, and I think Loki is a very archetypal character. That show is very archetypal. So yeah, the 4-function approach is how I take things into. So essentially, it's not that I can't. It's not that I think you can't, quote unquote, introverted or extroverted feeling. All right, see you later, Moby Squid. It's I think that types who have FI, for example, can't really like just shift into FE and use FE. It's like flipping over the entire coin. It's nothing super easy. But I think that one thing that I think people really don't understand, again, this comes back down to the information processing thing, is that they assume, for example, that if you're someone who likes to like take care of others, or if you're nice or you're agreeable, that you have like FE, for example. And that goes back to the thing of the actions coming from the information processing. For example, you could be an ENTJ and be an extremely nice and agreeable person. It just means that you've taken in the information that TE takes in and you've decided to do something different with it. You've decided not to just take that natural information and run right to the races. You can be whatever type of person you want to be within your given context of taking in information. There's just going to be things that come much more easily and more naturally to you if you are a certain type who takes in information in, a certain way. If you're an ESFP, you're going to be far more, immediately reactive. If you relate to the innocent one, you think is a good fit for a male. Makes sense. Innocent's a pretty interesting one. As I said in the beginning, I think IFPs can be innocents, but innocent's kind of a wide branching one. All right, well, we've been going for about an hour and a half. I'm gonna leave it one more minute. So if you got a question, I'll answer it in full, but I'm gonna take questions for one more minute, and then I'm gonna close off and head off. Which is more objective, TE or TI? I think TE, but not 100% sure. Well, if you go by strict definition, TE would be more objective because extroversion is objective in Carl Jung's system. And what do I mean by that? Well, it means that if you're an extroverted type, you're relying on some sort of objective information or stimulus to come to some sort of rational conclusion about the thing that you're interacting with. So extroverted thinking is objective rationality, and TI is subjective rationality. All the introverted functions are subjective. Introverted intuition is subjective and irrational. So it's subjective and irrational, the least rational of all the functions, whereas extroverted thinking is the most rational of all the functions because it's extroverted, objective, and it's irrational function thinking. So that's interesting in my opinion. But I don't think that inherently means that TE is more right. You want to make sure you don't think of it in that terms. It just means that TE is more likely to come to its conclusion based off of things that it can literally like see or use as evidence, as opposed to coming to some sort of internal or subjective conclusion. Because subjective can still be right. Subjective can still be entirely correct. It just means that, you know, the TE type is more likely to need some sort of external verification for it to be considered correct. All right, well, my throat hurts. I've been talking for an hour and a half, and I'm kind of tired. You know, this is a lot. I can already feel my voice starting to go because I'm not used to talking this much. This was a pleasure. I hope you all enjoyed this stream on archetypes. I will upload this onto YouTube tomorrow, most likely. If you enjoyed this, you know, let me know, and go like that video tomorrow if you can. I always appreciate the interaction with the video. I hope you all have yourself a great day, and I will see you either this weekend or next week for the next stream. See you later, guys. Bye.